Martin Hilpert. We are happy to see him here. He is a well-known scholar, a specialist on construction grammar, mainly, and again, he's a specialist in diachronic description, research on construction grammar. This is a very special domain, and we know there are lots and lots of people doing construction grammar and studying constructions in different languages, and there are people who are occupied with diachronic stuff, but combination of these two and with computational support is something very interesting, and so we are waiting for interesting examples and interesting lectures. 4 lectures, 2 today and 2 on Friday. And a few words about Martin Hilpert. Well, he works. He graduated from Freiburg University. Yes,
I spent some time in Freiburg. Yes.
Yeah, and then he studied and had his PhD in Rice University. Yes. So this is the great place for constructionalists all over the world, and he participated in FrameNet project of Charles Fillmore. Just like one of the students, plenty of them, of Charles Fillmore, and now he is professor in Neuchâtel, which is a very small but quite famous university in Switzerland. It became famously recently, very famous recently, because there was a very nice, they say, typological school there. Nearly at the same time we had dialects here. So we also had typological school just in the same period, because Martin Haspelmans just left our school and went to yours. So, Martin Hilpert.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. It's my first time to Moscow, and I've had a wonderful time these past 2 days already, and I hope to speak with many of you over the coming 3 days that I have left here. So I have different ideas that I want to share with you. So the talks that I have prepared touch on construction grammar, of course. They touch on corpus linguistic methodology. They touch on language change and how all of these topics come together. Now, I hope I will be somewhat coherent bringing these topics together. And the way I want to start tonight is with a presentation of research projects that I have done that go in this direction. And the focus of this first lecture will be very much on methodological issues. The second talk for tonight will focus more on issues of theory. So we'll get to reflect on the results and the insights that I'll present in this talk later on from a more theoretical perspective. I'll try to talk in such a way that we can have a break maybe at 7:15 or 7:30. What do you think, Natalia?
It's up to you.
7:30? Okay, that will work. Right. So I apologize that I'm giving these lectures in English, yeah, but that's all I can do, I'm afraid. And I also apologize that most of the examples that you will see are actually from English. But I think that you will be able to look at these results, look at these studies, and think about how you might be able to apply them to data sets of your own, to analyses in other languages. Well, you're welcome to ask me questions at any point so that we can discuss things that maybe are not fully clear. Okay, so this first lecture tonight I called Approaches to Variation and Change from a Constructional Perspective. So this talk is about several things. Variation, change, but also a third notion that comes into play when we look at variation and change, namely productivity. And all of these I want to look at from the perspective of construction grammar. Now, I know that many of you in this room are interested in construction grammar and are working on constructional research. So let me just say a very few words on how I use construction grammar, how I understand construction grammar. So I view construction grammar as a cognitive theory of linguistic knowledge. So it's a model of what speakers know when they know a language. And the architecture of this model has the shape and structure of a network. So construction grammar views linguistic knowledge as a network of symbolic units, that is, form-meaning pairings. These form-meaning pairings, they comprise different sorts of linguistic elements, words, of course, but also larger units, so argument structure constructions, schematic, sentence-level constructions, but also word formation processes. I'll say more about word formation processes in just a second. And the question that relates to variation and change in productivity is when speakers hear a construction, how easily can they actually discern the schematic construction that they hear? And how easily can they associate that schematic construction with different lexical items? All right. So there are several questions that I want to go into in a little bit more detail in this talk. So first of all, can we somehow measure or operationalize productivity of constructions as a property of this model of linguistic knowledge, that is, as a property of the constructional network? Yeah. When I say properties of the constructional network, I'm thinking of the nodes in the network and how they are connecting. So one particular node may have a specific number of connections that may be larger or smaller than the connections that other constructions have. But it can also concern the ability to create new connections. So a node in the network may branch out to further nodes in the network, and also this is an aspect of productivity. And lastly, how can we investigate productivity in constructions? And here I will be using synchronic and diachronic corpora as data for my research questions. So in this talk, there will be 3 parts, each of them addressing one case study from a different linguistic domain. So I will start with a domain from word formation and processes, and I'll talk about a construction that I call the vement construction. So it has a verbal element, then it has a derivational suffix that is pronounced ment, and that gives you nouns, English nouns, such as government or punishment or things like that. The second part will be devoted to a, well, idiosyncratic, idiomatic construction that many of you may not be familiar with. I call this the many-a-noun construction. Those will be examples like, I've experienced many a surprise during my stay in Moscow. Yeah, so there's a idiosyncratic syntactic structure here, and I'll talk about the traits of that construction in that part of the talk. And the last part will be not a word formation process, not a syntactic construction, but rather a morphosyntactic construction, so right between those 2 other levels. And there I'll be talking about noun participle compounds such as whiskey soaked or chocolate covered or doctor recommended or others of this type. And then that will bring me to some conclusions. All right, so without further ado, let me come to the first case study. And the basic story of this case study is that the suffix ment has undergone a turbulent development of a birth, a short life, and then a horrible death. So I call this the life and death of ment. And I got interested into this construction because there is something of a puzzle that intrigued me. So in present-day English, there are around 1,000 words, 1,000 noun types that end in the suffix. Yeah? So there's punishment, there's government, there's judgment, there's lots of them, yeah? Around 1,000. And when we look at corpora, many of these forms are actually quite infrequent or barely there at all. So there's a substantial number of ment forms that occur only once in a corpus, that are hapax legomena. And all of this would lead you to think that this ment suffix is really productive, that speakers can play around with it, that speakers can create new words on the basis of that schema, and yet it seems that the suffix is unproductive when we try to do new things with it. So let's say that I emailed back and forth with a colleague over an entire morning. I can jokingly say to a friend, oh, I had this huge email ment this morning, yeah? But it's not a real word of English. Yeah? So I can look at all the empty glass bottles and old papers and whatnot, and I can say to my wife, oh, look at all our recyclements. She would probably smile, but you know, it's not, again, a real word. It's something that I just made up jokingly. So even though we can do that, speakers know that this is really not a sign that the suffix is productive. It doesn't work, simply. We cannot create new words on the basis of this suffix. So given all that, I was puzzled, and I thought, okay, what is going on with ment? Why do we see it behaving in this particular way? So let me focus on these 4 questions here to address this puzzle. First, I will say in a few words what this V-ment construction actually is. And then I will get into the issue of variation and change in diachrony. So I want to find out how this construction changed in productivity. Yeah? So when was it that speakers freely created new forms with it? When did that suddenly come to a halt? I also want to talk about how this construction changed in form and function over time. Yeah? So it hasn't always been the same with regard to form and function. And that will inform the issue of constructional productivity. That will be the 4th issue that I will talk about. Okay, so coming directly to the first issue, the V-ment construction is what you would traditionally call a word formation process. So it is a combination of a lexical stem and a derivational suffix that has a certain phonemic structure. Yeah? So nothing extraordinary, nothing surprising there. The stem that ment attaches to strongly tends to be verbal. So in punishment, we have punish. In judgment, we have judge. In government, we have govern. So all of these are verbal stems to which ment attaches. There are some exceptions. So in merriment, we have an adjectival stem. In scholarment, we have a nominal stem. That's possible, but those forms are relatively infrequent, so we don't see many of them. We can also say something about the meaning of this ment construction. So typically, the noun conveys the meaning of an action as an adjustment. We need to make an adjustment there. We need to maybe turn a wheel on the machine or do something. It can also be the result of an action. So an assortment of chocolate is not the act of putting the chocolates together, but rather it is the box that you can buy in the shop. Yeah? So the result rather than the action itself. So there's a metonymic relation. Or it can also be the means to accomplish an action. When we have a refreshment, yeah? So this is a refreshment, it's not. It's the means to have a drink and refresh yourself. It is not the act of refreshing yourself. Okay, so that gives you a broad overview of what the construction is structurally. Let me outline a very, very short history of this construction. What is it that we know about it? We know that it started quite early in English. So there were isolated Latin loans during Old English times. But seriously, the construction opened for business after the Norman conquest. So we see the construction really starting as a wave of French loans coming into the English language after 1066, the Norman conquest. So it's kind of a borrowed phenomenon. That's how it got started. Not only did it get borrowed, it also got nativized. So after a while, we see that the speakers of Middle English started to use the construction with Germanic stems. Yeah? So that would be evidence that there was a schema that was nativized, that the speakers were familiar with, and that they used productively. But this was short-lived. Yeah? So we see new loans receding after 1600, and then shortly after that, overall productivity receding as well. And what we have in present-day English is kind of a graveyard of the construction, a residue of about 1,000 types that are still in the lexicon that speakers use and have memorized. And despite the large number of the 1,000 types, the construction as such is non-productive, so that we cannot use things like emailment or recyclement or jogment or kissment. The list could go on indefinitely. Okay, so how did this construction change in productivity? When did that happen and how? So in order to find out about this diachronic phenomenon, I used a resource that is strictly speaking not a corpus, but that can be used as a corpus. So there is the Oxford English Dictionary that contains not only entries of words, but also citations of words in their original context. And those contexts, I'll show you a picture in a minute, are actually dated, so that we can approximate the time at which these words would have emerged in English. Yeah? Of course, there's no guarantee that the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary caught the very first attestations, yeah? But they were thorough enough so that we can use their records as an approximation of that. So I retrieved from the Oxford English Dictionary all quotations with meant types. Let me just show you how this looks. So here we have the lexical entry for achievement. Yeah? So there is some etymological information, there is a definition, the action of achieving something, so this is expressing an action rather than a result or a means. And then we have these citations here, yeah? Starting with one that is dated 1477, with the achievement of these devices. Okay, so that would give us the information that we need to actually track when new forms with meant entered the English language and how many forms were created in this way. So I retrieved all the meant forms and tracked their frequencies over time. And when I was done with that, I made a terrible discovery, namely that other researchers had done the exact same thing before me. Yeah? And not only one team of researchers, but two. Okay, so after the shock had receded, I thought, okay, well, this may actually, there may be an advantage to this. I can see this as a kind of replication, and we can see how reliable the results actually are. So what you see in this graph is an overlay of the 3 studies and their frequency counts. And you can kind of see there's broad agreement. Yeah, at least we're not looking at terribly different things. So one is Anshin and Aronoff, those are the black dots. Then there's Laurie Bauer, who found fewer forms overall. Yeah, so it appears that Anshin and Aronoff were a little bit more generous, and then Bauer was a little bit more critical, and then there's me, more or less. So I'm the triangles. For the most part, I am right there in the middle between Anshin and Aronoff and Bauer, and for me that was actually good enough. Yeah? You notice that I have a few more here in the last periods. That's because new forms are added incrementally to the Oxford English Dictionary. So that explains why I diverge from Ancient and Aronoff in the latest period. Okay, so this shape has the peculiar shape of a camel, yeah, and that well, that might puzzle you. So what is going on? That we have these two peaks there. Well, Laurie Bauer in his study actually interprets this camel curve very literally and states that the productivity of Ment peaks twice, first in the early 17th century, so that's the big peak, and then again in the early 19th century, that would be the second one. Well, there are reasons to take issue with this claim if we look at the overall number of words that are represented in the Oxford English Dictionary. So the citations that are sampled in the dictionary are relatively few in early years, and in the later centuries there was simply more material. Yeah? So the chances of finding Ment forms are much, much higher in these later years. So the simplest thing to do in such a case when the corpus is unbalanced is simply to normalize the frequencies, which is what you see here. So once we normalize the frequencies, the camel shape goes away, and what we have is something that looks like, well, there's, yeah, the first part is not so clear, but from 1550 onwards, all three studies see the construction in a more or less linear decline. Yeah, so this looks much more like a natural phenomenon that we can actually interpret rather than the camel curve with its two peaks. Okay, so this, you might argue, is actually a better reflection of how the productivity of Ment developed, normalized type frequencies, so that we can say that after the borrowing of the construction, when it was nativized, there was a phase of it being relatively productive. Yeah? So that is consistent with all three of the initial curves that we see here. But then productivity declined from something like 1550 onward. That's a possible interpretation, but in most synchronic approaches to productivity that are corpus-based, there are actually other measures of productivity that are preferred to normalize type frequencies or type frequencies as such. So most measures in corpus linguistics actually take hapax frequencies into account. So forms that occur only once in the corpus and how many of them there are. And so one measure that I was able to apply to my diachronic data is a measure that goes by the name of expanding productivity. It's one of Harald Bayern's measures. And the way you have to imagine expanding productivity is that it is computed as a ratio where we count a number of things. First of all, we count all hapax legomena of our construction. Yeah? If you imagine that this is the corpus that has lots of words in it, and different letters represent different word types. Yeah? In the corpus, we have a construction, and we retrieve all tokens of that construction from the corpus, and then we see how many different types there are. Well, this construction in this toy example has only 3 different types, A, B, and C. And B and C occur only once. Yeah? So those would be our hapaxes. What this means is that we have 2 hapaxes out of 5 tokens that are evidence for the productivity of this construction. Now, expanding productivity does not only take the hapax frequency of a construction into account, but it divides that frequency by the number of all hapax legomena that are found in the corpus as such. Yeah? So also in the corpus we have a number of different types. Yeah? So there are X, Z, F, G, Y, E, and a couple of others. Yeah? So if we count here the types that occur only once, F, G, E, H, and D, we get a total number of hapax legomena in the corpus of 7, namely those 5 that don't occur in the construction and the 2 that actually do occur in the construction. So that gives us a ratio of 2 out of 7. So the construction, if you like, is responsible for 2 hapaxes out of 7 in total. Yeah? So that means it has a certain share in the overall neologisms of the corpus. So it holds, if you like, 29% of all of the creative business that is going on in the corpus. And this is, of course, a constructed example, so no construction would ever reach percentages this high. But this you can interpret as a measure of how productive that construction actually is at that point. So I took my diachronic data from the OED and I computed values of expanding productivity for all decades that I had in my database. So that gives you a curve that looks kind of like the normalized frequencies. Yeah? So for each decade, I looked how many hapaxes are overall in the data, how many of those are a meant form. Yeah? So we get from a high ratio to lower and lower and lower ratios with some wiggling in between. Yeah? But overall, this curve is consistent with the normalized type frequencies, which say that around 1500, yeah, this is where the decline really began to set in. Okay. Now, summing up the answer to this first question, how did the demand construction change in productivity? I think it's reasonable to say that there was just one peak in productivity, namely in the 13th century after it was borrowed. So this would coincide with the phenomenon of nativization of the construction. Yeah? And what this means is that, well, after the construction was borrowed, it was a successful invention. Yeah? It was fashionable for a while, but the popularity of the construction faded rather quickly. And so a metaphor that I would like to offer for this is that the construction is kind of like the Rubik's Cube of the Middle English period. So when it came out, everybody needed to have one. Yeah? And everybody was crazy playing with it for a while, but then it sort of faded in popularity until, you know, there was kind of bottom line effect. Yeah? And the analogy even goes further than that, namely, no matter, so I have friends with children, and if you go into those children's rooms, there will be some drawer, some basket, you know, some corner or a shelf where you will actually find one of these Rubik's Cubes that are a little damaged and worn out. Yeah? So like the Rubik's Cubes, the meant words, they are still in the English lexicon. Yeah? It's just that they're not as popular as they used to be. Yes?
May I ask you about the just expanded productivity
yes.
measure, because I'm not sure I fully understand why it is measured in this way and whether it's really indicative of anything as such. I understand I see its value when it's interpreted as a curve with diachronic changes, but it looks like, well, probably I just don't understand the reasoning, but imagine if a certain well, I'm sorry, I'm formulating my thoughts in this way.
Yeah, don't worry.
On the move. Okay, so imagine we find a certain construction to be. Sorry. Okay, let me put it another way. What if we count this productivity by means of this formula, and we find that but we come up with a certain figure. How do we interpret a particular number? Because, for instance, we get something like, I don't know, 0.01. Is it a lot or is it not a lot? I don't think it's possible to interpret the figure in isolation. So
that's exactly right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the absolute values don't tell you anything. What tells you something is either when you make a comparison between two constructions in the same corpus at the same time. Yeah? So there you have a relative degree of, so you have two numbers that you can compare. Yeah? You have an anchor and a comparison. So whether something is 0.01 or 0.005, that in itself doesn't tell you anything. Yeah? So the only time when, the only way in which this measure tells you something is either when you compare two constructions in the same corpus, or if you do what I did, namely comparing the same construction across different corpora. These can be different corpora from the same time, just from different genres, or they can be corpora that reflect different time periods from the same genre. So in that case, when you get values that you can compare against each other, then there's actually something that you can get out of it. But from the absolute values, you're absolutely right, there's nothing that you can read out of them.
Yeah, may I ask a further question
Yes.
on the same thing? What about the measure? Well, I was familiar with a different measure of violence, also based on Hilpert, but with the ratio of Hilpert of a particular construction to all the tokens of this particular construction, or all types of this particular construction. This seems intuitively more appealing.
Yeah, and I would have used it.
Compares, it's not so easily biased by all sorts of reasons why certain other constructions, which have nothing to do with the one you're measuring, can be more frequent in terms of parts.
Yeah. So the measure that you're talking about, I would have liked to use it, except it is sensitive to one thing that is crucial, namely the size of the corpus. So this was one hard constraint that I couldn't get around. So I believe that expanding productivity is not quite as sensitive to the size of the corpus, and that's why I resorted to it in this case. In other cases, when you have a large corpus and you just want to compare, let's say, the productivity degrees of 4 or 5 different affixes, then I would also go for affixes divided by the overall tokens, which gives you fairly robust results. Or go to Stefan Müller's LNRE models, large number of rare events. That is a number that has been argued to be even more sophisticated and even more reliable in certain cases. Okay. No, thank you for your question. Okay. Now, moving on to the next part of the issue here. Well, how did the construction change in form and function across its lifespan? So we have this curve of decreasing productivity, and I wanted to use this curve to come up with different periods in the development of the construction. So when you look at the curve, you can kind of see that there is a decrease first, then there's this wiggly part in the middle, and then there is this decrease towards the end. So one thing that I was trying to do was to see whether we would be able to see different developmental stages in this kind of data. And for that, I used a technique that my colleague Stefan Gries and I have been working on. And this technique is called variability-based neighbor clustering. So this is a clustering algorithm that is able to determine periods in historical data in a bottom-up data-driven way, so that we don't have to decide a priori. So we're going to look at one century, then the next century, and then the next century. But rather, we let the data decide itself what periods we actually find in the data. So this is basically an algorithm that uses hierarchical clustering, except there is one constraint, namely the algorithm is only allowed to merge data points that are directly adjacent in time. Yeah? I'll explain in more detail how this actually works. So here again you see the curve with the decreasing values of expanding productivity, only this time I didn't draw the line between them, I just drew the different values that I computed. And so what variability-based neighbor clustering does is that it finds the two closest neighbors, the two neighbors that have the least amount of difference between them. And in this case, I mean, you can look for yourself which 2 points that are directly adjacent show the least amount of difference. Yeah? It's those two. Yeah? You can kind of see that the first ones, they have huge differences, and then later on this kind of decreases a little bit, but those two, so that is 1550 and 1650, those actually are relatively close. So then it merges these values and takes the mean value and runs the whole procedure over again. So again, it goes through the points and tries to find the 2 points that are the most similar to one another. And so this time we find these two neighbors here. Again, we merge them, we take the average value, and we repeat the process over and over again until all periods and all groups of periods are merged together. Yeah? So this is essentially a way to determine where in this curve do we have periods that are relatively similar to one another, and those we would want to call a single developmental stage, yeah? And where do we have large breaks? Yeah? So when we have a large break, we can set one piece of the data aside, and the other piece of the data represents a different period. So once the algorithm has done its work, it gives us a clustering algorithm that is a dendrogram that is a result of the algorithm that shows us which periods group together in what ways. Yeah? So here you can see that those are the two that were grouped together first, then these two are grouped together next. We have these two that are grouped together relatively early, and these periods here, they are grouped together at a relatively early stage into a group of periods. So those actually form a period that we can compare against others, such as this one here, yeah? Or if we go further to this side, these here form a period, and then these two form a period at the very beginning. Okay, so what this allows us is to cut the data into historical periods that may not be of the exact same length. Yeah? So we have some periods that are just 1 half century long or so, and we have others that are several centuries long. But the division reflects when something interesting happens with the construction. Yeah? So when we have a long phase of relative stasis, yeah, we want to group that data together, and this is what the algorithm does for us. Okay, so in the following, I will compare these different stages in the life of the construction with regard to how the construction behaves with regard to form and function. And for that, I went through the following analytical steps. So the first one was that I looked at the literature on the construction and at the data, and I try to determine relevant variables. So how can the construction be described in terms of different variables? And then I annotated all types that I had in my database, about 1,400, for these variables. And then I explored whether patterns of variation change over time. And for that, I used a multivariate approach. So what variables did I annotate for? The first one, very simply, was the etymological source. So is a particular form of the meant construction borrowed or is it derived? Forms such as achievement or detachment or enforcement, they are borrowed from Norman French. And then there are derived forms that are formed with Germanic stems, such as pickerment or erasement or shipment. And again, the OED thankfully has the information on this. So I trusted the dictionary here and coded forms as borrowed when the dictionary told me that they were actually borrowed. What you see is that in the early stages, there are more borrowed forms than derived forms. And then there is a gradual increase of more and more natively derived forms. And they peak just around 1550. Yeah? And after that, both the derived and the borrowed forms go down more or less in parallel ways. The next variable was the type of the stem. So what's the lexical category of the stem that you can see in the construction? And I already told you that most of the stems are verbal, as an achievement or an enforcement. That's the white triangles here. So most of the examples in the database are actually verbal with regard to the stem. There are a few adjectival formations such as merriment or unrulyment, and also just a few nominal elements like scholarment or utensilment. Don't ask me what that even means. Yeah? So those two curves you see right down there, they don't really account for a lot of data, and the little data that we have from them happens early on in the history. The next variable concerned the internal morphological structure of the forms that I had. Yeah? So there are forms that I coded as binary branching, where we have a simplex stem, like judge, attached to the suffix. So in judgment, we have a structure that has just two parts, yeah, or treatment. There are a number of formations where the stem is actually internally complex. So in enrichment, we have a complex, morphologically complex verb that is the stem. That is left branching. Belittlement, the same thing. Yeah? And then there are forms where we have a binary form that is prefixed by another element in the front. Yeah? And so in forms like eco-management or non-agreement, we have these binary forms and a prefix. So these are forms that I called right branching because the right part of the form is internally complex. Now what you see in this graph here is that the construction started out with binary forms, yeah, the simple ones, and then the left branching types took over around 1450. Yeah? Again, 1550, the fateful year, that's when things start going south. Yeah? And the interesting thing now is that these right branching types, they come in rather late, yeah? And they kind of persist even in the later periods. So I'll talk about why that is and how this can be explained.
Sorry, could I
Yes.
ask you why non-agreement is right branching when with prefixes is left branching? Maybe non is also prefix.
Yes, but non-agree is not a constituent in non-agreement. So non-agree, you don't find non-agree as a verb. Yeah. If you were to find non-agree as a verb, I would have coded this as a case of left branching. Yeah. But as it is here, I would analyze this morphologically so that non is a prefix that has agreement in its scope. Was that your question, or? Did I explain that right, or you don't look happy? We can talk about this.
Yeah.
We can talk. Yeah.
This has to do with your previous slide, but in getting the data, did you take into account that lexical categories change over time as well? So like it may further, you know, you may not have any adjectival examples because Mary may have been a verb or something like that prior. Because I know there's lexical categories
Yeah.
will change over time.
Yeah, yeah. So there are some cases where I had to make questionable decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but with regard to merriment and unrulement, I think you can be relatively safe in saying that okay, those are adjectival stems, but there are certain forms. Mostly those that existed already in Old English times and were borrowed from Latin, where you can really only figure out what the lexical category was if you do some serious etymology. And there, I think, you could argue, we could argue about those individual cases. At the end of the day, those arguable cases, there aren't all that many of them. Yeah? So for most of the data that you see, I would be relatively confident that we could sit down together and agree on what it is. Yeah. Okay. All right. The next variable actually has to do with meaning and with the particularly with the meaning of the verbal examples in the database. So some of the verbal stems are transitive. For instance, the verb punish is transitive. You punish someone. Yeah? And so forms like punishment or arousement I coded as transitive because the form evokes an entity that is being acted upon, a patient. And there are verbs such as flourish that are clearly intransitive. So in flourishment, there is no form evoked that would be acted upon, rather flourishment can be coded as intransitive in meaning. With regard to adjectives such as merry, yeah, there it again becomes a matter of argumentation. Does the form make us think of a patient or does it not? Yeah. Overall, as you see in the curve, most cases of the Riemann construction are actually transitive in meaning, so that we think of some patient-like entity. And again, we see the kind of relation between the curves that the intransitive ones are less frequent, but they show the same basic shape so that things go up or up and down in a wiggly way, but then after 1550 everything goes down in more or less parallel ways. Last variable then was concerned with meaning in a different way. So I asked myself which overall meaning is conveyed by the form. I already talked about meant forms encoding actions, such as confrontment or dismantlement. So those are actions of confronting or dismantling. There are results of action. So think of the assortment of chocolates, but a settlement, yeah, that is the result of settling down, or scholarment, that is the published books that you find in the library. Then there are means, such as refreshments and ornaments, so it means to make something else pretty. And then there's a garbage can category where I call this place, yeah? So to include forms such as parliament or environment. Now, parliament and environment, those are places in a very broad sense. It's probably not the the main idea behind parliament, but anyway, those types in the place category you see here that again they are not very frequent. Most forms encode actions. A close second, then we have results, then we have means, and only after that places. And again, the pattern shows an initial increase and then a decrease later on. Okay, now how did I analyze these data. So when you have categorical data like this, where you have a bunch of examples, a database with examples, and annotations for different categories where you say, this example is either one category or the other, or some other category still. What you can do is some kind of cross-tabulation so that you see which combinations of variables are relatively overrepresented and relatively underrepresented. So this is the kind of tabular data that you could feed, for instance, into a chi-square test. So here we have a table where I cross-tabulated the branching variable into binary branching, left branching, right branching, and I cross-tabulated that with the transitivity variable. So here are the transitive types, and up there are the intransitive types. So some basic observations that we can make. So there are many more transitive types than intransitive types. You saw that in the graph. There are relatively many binary branching types. There are lots of left branching types, but most of them transitive. And there are only few right branching types, but those that we have, they tend to be transitive. Now, of course, the purpose of cross-tabulating data in this way is to see whether some cells in the table are significantly overrepresented or significantly underrepresented. You can look at the numbers, but if you're like me, you can stare at them and not really see intuitively what is going on. So here is a little visual aid. So when we have red numbers, that is a statistical test saying that this number is significantly overrepresented, and blue numbers are significantly underrepresented, given how frequent the category is. Yeah? So we have forms that are relatively underrepresented in the category of transitive and binary. Yeah? So even though this number is large, it's not as large as we would expect it to be. Yeah? Here, well, oh, sorry. Yeah. Relatively over represented are these 670 here. Yeah? So transitive left branching types such as enlargement. Yeah? And again, strongly overrepresented are the intransitive binary branching types, things like settlement, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is just my memory aid, yeah, so those types up there. Intransitive binary would be words like settlement. The binary transitive would be things like treatment and punishment. They're frequent, but still not as frequent as we would expect. And then things like enlargement, they are reasonably more frequent than we would expect, given what the overall frequencies are, the marginal frequencies. Okay, now I've annotated these data for not just 2 variables, but for 5. And that gives us the opportunity to look at the distribution in more complex ways. So here we have 2 variables that are cross-tabulated. Here we have 3. Yeah. So that's again the same data, but now we have another variable included, namely the variable of etymology. So what we see here is that this corner of the data structure is overpopulated. These are overrepresented. So right branching transitive types, they tend to be always native, never borrowed. Yeah? So there's this asymmetry here. Another thing that we can see is that binary branching transitive forms, here we have the borrowed forms that are overrepresented. Yeah? So things like judgment and punishment, they're more often than not, they're borrowed rather than natively derived. And lastly, if we look in the upper area of the cube, so there we see binary branching intransitive types that are overrepresented both in the native forms and in the borrowed forms. Yeah? So this can give you an idea of how these three variables of transitivity and branching and etymology actually hang together, yeah? And how they are mutually dependent, and where in this variational space something interesting happens. But as human beings, we can look at these cubes and look at three variables at one time. But when we get to 4 or 5 variables, we sort of run out of dimensions in natural space, which makes it very difficult to imagine what is going on unless you have the mind of a physicist or maybe a mathematician. Yours truly, sorry, I can't do it. But of course, this is where computers come in. Yeah? So I can simply outsource this task and use a method such as configural frequency analysis. So for this type of analysis, I can cross-tabulate all the types in my database for the variables that I annotated. Yeah? So source, stem, branching, transitivity, and semantics. And also for the time period. Yeah? This is crucial. So every example in my database, every type, has annotations for these different variables. And what configural frequency analysis can do is to determine configurations of values that occur with greater than chance frequency. So if you imagine this hyperdimensional space, this method can tell me, look, in this area of the hyperdimensional space, there's really a lot going on. And in this area of the hyperdimensional space, I don't see anything. Yeah? So it's kind of like when you look at the cube, there's one corner where there's almost nothing, and there's one corner where there's a lot more than we would expect by chance. Okay, and the purpose of doing this was that I wanted to see if early types of the construction actually differ from later types. Yeah? So do we find in earlier data configurations of these variables that differ from configurations that we see in later periods? So let me briefly talk about those results. Here we see a configuration that's particularly frequent in the very first period. And those types take the shape of words like commencement. So they're borrowed, trivially so, and they have a transitive verbal stem. And this is very much consonant with previous analyses that claim that early ment types typically had transitive verbs as their hosts. Yeah? So there have been some early studies that have come up with this result, and this is confirmed by the analysis. Moving on to the second period, there are a few interesting things that are maybe a little bit unexpected going on between 1300 and 1399. So there are forms like ointment. So an ointment, that is a cream that you can put on a wound or something. These are borrowed, have a verbal stem, are transitive, are binary branching, and express a means. So an ointment is a means of healing yourself. So there are others like supplement or ornament, which fall into the same category. And the method picks this out because the semantic type of means is not at all frequent, but it rises to a moderate level of frequency during just this particular period. Okay. Another type that is overrepresented in the third period is illustrated by types like vesselment. So also those are borrowed, but they have nominal stems. I coded them as transitive, binary branching, and again, representing the means interpretation. So words like monument, vesselment, they are also very much infrequent, but still more frequent than we would expect. And because both nominal examples and means examples are rare, their combination is really rarer still, so that this is picked out by the analysis. Coming to the third period, this is where the construction begins to start on its career path, really, with type 4 in the form of words such as enlargement. So here we have derived forms with a verbal stem that is transitive and left branching, yeah, and large is morphologically complex, and that express an action. So this is actually the most frequent configuration in the database. I was happy to see this configuration come out in the statistical analysis, because this type actually explains why certain neologisms are more acceptable than others. Yeah? So in earlier studies of the construction, it has been argued that forms such as encodement or envisionment, yeah, they don't exist, but they sound kind of like they could exist. Yeah? So speakers would argue that, yeah, I may have heard that it's okay to say that. The reason it is okay is that these forms are very close to this schematic pattern. Yeah? So a verb that is transitive, left branching, and expressive in action. Yes, you had a question.
These two particular examples seem only to imply that NV-ment is productive. Yeah. But is it the case with other kinds, like dis-V-ment or something?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. So I picked those on purpose, yeah, because with N, verbs with an N prefix that are internally complex, with those, this works rather well. I would imagine that, you know, when you pick something with dis or other prefixes, you might get results that differ in acceptability, but I haven't tested that. Okay. There's something else going on in this period here. Namely, there is a sort of strange little pattern that is exemplified by words such as merriment, where we have adjectival stems. They are also natively derived. Yeah? They encode actions. I coded them as intransitive and binary branching. And this is sort of, yeah, a funny little pattern that is genuinely English, not based on any borrowed coinages. And it's innovative, but it's ultimately very short-lived. So all the types that are in the database occur within a very short 60-year time span. And earlier I used the Rubik's Cube analogy for the entire construction. So this would be kind of taking this analogy one step further. So this is kind of an even crazier variation on the original Rubik's Cube. People thought it was a good idea at the time, but it didn't really catch on and was forgotten soon after. All right, now moving into the last part of the data. We have words of the type disembodiment, so right branching, verbal action, expressing transitive verbs that are derived. Those are typically coined on the basis of type 4 forms. Yeah? So we have something like enlargement or embodiment. We can put a dis in front of it and get to these right branching types. So it's reasonable to think of this as an outgrowth of the earlier type 4 prototype. Yeah? And the existence and the flourishing of this particular type is really independent of the productivity of the suffix itself. Yeah? So there are lots of host elements of the type 4 structure that exist that are possible hosts for this type if we just put a prefix in front of it. So this type can continue to be productive and thrive even while other types of the Riemann construction are already going down. So this can buck the trend and go the other way. Okay, and then we see a variation on this in the last period, so semi-retirement. That's structurally the same, except it expresses a result rather than an action. Again, representing a metonymic shift from actions to results. Okay, let me give you a brief summary of all of these changes. So, breaking it all down, I would argue that the Riemann construction underwent the following changes. First, nativization in the 13th century. Then we have a prototype that emerges in the 15th century, which uses prefixed, transitive, verbal hosts and encodes the meaning of action. And then some bylines come and go in the 14th and 17th century. There's the verbal means construction type there with poisonment and garnishment. There are these adjectival formations that have been popular for a short time, like merriment and drariment. And then at the end of the development, right branching really takes over, and the productivity of meant comes to a halt in the 20th century. Okay, so what about that productivity puzzle? There are lots of hapaxes in present English, but no productivity. This can be explained in the following way, I think. So the Wieman construction enters English as a bundle of lexical borrowings. It briefly becomes a grammatical schema, but then ceases to be productive and leaves behind a large residue of native lexical formations. And these formations are then subject to prefixation. So we have a large number of right-branching hapaxes like semi-retirement and eco-management that don't really reflect the productivity of men, but rather something that happened to the existing types that were there in the lexicon. And in this sense, the right-branching hapaxes create a sense of false productivity. So they inflate our expectations of how productive meant really is. All right. I'm coming to the second part, the second case study, the many a noun construction. Yes,
Can
sorry.
I ask about the clustering operation? So how
Yeah.
do you understand when where to stop? Because you have like 5 periods, but why do you have 5 and not more and not less?
Yeah, okay. So one answer to that question would be you go with what's practical. Yeah? So given this, this dendrogram, this clustering solution, there are different options that you can take. So at any point of the y-axis, you can draw a straight line and simply count the clusters that you have. Okay, so if we start here, this is the first cluster, this is the second one, and we have one very large one here, and one that is a bit smaller here. The 5-cluster solution comes into play when you do the cut here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yeah. When you start here. Yeah.
Yeah, but how did you guess that you should take that point
Yeah.
and cut there?
Okay. So the compromise is this: you want to go as low as possible, and you want to keep the number of clusters as low as possible. Yeah? So you want to explain. So the further down we are, the more precision we have. Yeah? The further up we are, the fewer clusters we have. We have to find a compromise. Yeah? And there is no, I'm afraid there is no right and wrong to this kind of approach. This is an art rather than a science, even if it looks very science to begin with. Yeah?
So you try it empirically.
Well, so in a way, what I did was, okay, let's adopt a 5-cluster solution and see whether the results that we get out of that are meaningful and can be interpreted. Yeah. So in that sense, I would say that drawing the line at any particular point is a heuristic. It's you're taking a chance at that point. Yeah. So if you were to draw the line up here, you would have 3 clusters, 1, 2, and 3, but one of them would be very large. Yeah? So you would say, okay, I'm averaging over all of this. This is maybe not desirable. Yeah? So maybe you want to have some some more precision. Yeah? And for instance, if I look at this cluster here, yeah, so all of these periods from 1675 to 1875, they're grouped together at a relatively early stage in the process. So this looks very much like a natural cluster, something that really belongs together. So So I would definitely want this cluster as one individual cluster in my analysis. Yeah? So when you adopt that approach, I guess the minimal thing to do would be the 5 cluster analysis that I used, yeah, starting here. But you could also go further down. Yeah? So for instance, if you were to go down here, you would start with 3 individual periods, then you have this large cluster, then you have the cluster that we want, and then you have a third one. That might not be the worst thing in the world, yeah. So except that you now here have 3 periods that are relatively that are minimally of minimal length, yeah. And so the trade-off is not only how precise do you want to be, but also how much data do you have for each particular period. So I wanted to have enough data in each period to be able to say something meaningful about it. Yeah? And of course, as always in historical studies, we have fewer data points in the earlier periods most of the time. And so there the question is, okay, do we want to lump these together and average over them, which incurs the risk of making averages that are not really meaningful? Or do we say, okay, we'll look at these individually and then maybe we don't have as many examples, but at least we have precision, and that's what we prioritize in this case. Yes?
Yeah, just a short question. So something has happened between 1425 and 1525, and usually during some drawing this historical timelines of construction evolution, this curves seem rather frustrating, and usually suspect some corpus bias. And then you think maybe yes, there is corpus bias, but maybe there is somewhere else corpus bias, but you don't see that. So how do you explain this?
The wiggly bit
of 1475.
Yeah, yeah. So the way I see it is that during this particular time, yeah, so the wiggling all happens in the 3rd period, which is when 2 main things happen. First of all, the constructional prototype comes into being. That is sort of the constitution of what has of the pattern that gives us the most types in the construction. The other thing that happens is that during this time, not only the prototype emerges, but also these funny sidelines of the constructions that never really became very popular. So the way I interpret these wavy lines, and maybe that's over-interpreting it, but nonetheless, you ask for my 2 cents and you get some speculation in return. So what I think happened is that speakers during this time tried out different things with the construction. Some of the things worked, yeah, and others just didn't catch on. So that's how we get some periods where we get a little increase and some with a little decrease. Could it also be corpus bias? Yes, of course. Yeah. So with a database like this, that's not even a corpus, that's just a dictionary. We can never be sure what led the contributors to select exactly those citations. Yeah. How many were sent in? That's another. Yeah, it's just coincidence. So there are lots of question marks. Yeah. So if you'd rather say that this wiggly bit that doesn't mean anything, we should just smooth it over and say there's a straight line and not worry too much about the squiggles, I'd be fine with that as well. Yeah? But what I think we can say, what comes out of the analysis is that this period, especially in the beginning, is when there was the least amount of stability in the use of the construction. So there people were trying out things, some of them worked, others didn't. Yes?
This may go beyond what you wanted to do, but did you look at where so then we get other additional verbal morphology as well, supplementing, something like that. And if you were able to identify any historical, like where did that begin and how did that change alongside what you're looking at here?
So you mean different morphological?
Suffixes, yeah, other morphological suffixes on this. So I know you've got the right branching one. I think.
Yeah.
You have that, but it seems like there's other stuff that starts happening to it as well, and where that starts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I haven't looked at this, but it would be very interesting to do that. I'm looking at my watch. I think it's time to take a break now. Yeah, and we'll come back to the second and third part after the break. Thanks a lot.